Let's take a look at the first domain of the CRISC examination. That is risk identification. Whether we're certified or not, it's vital that as risk professionals, we understand how to identify risk within our workplaces. It's also vital that we empower all our employees, our colleagues, our managers to understand risk and to understand how to identify risk and to report such risk rather than overlook the risk. Here's the IT risk management life cycle. And the first task is, of course, to identify relevant threats and vulnerabilities and to document these as risks in the risk register. What is the objective of IT risk identification? It's to contribute to the execution of the IT risk management strategy in support of what? In support of the corporate or business objectives. And as we're contributing towards the successful execution of the IT risk management strategy, we need to ensure that we remain in alignment with the enterprise risk management strategy. It's all about the business, remember. We're not managing risk for the sake of IT. We're managing risk for the sake of our business, to support the business's corporate objectives. How do we identify risk within our workplaces? And I've written here, not for lone rangers, simply because it's not the sole responsibility of the IT risk professional to identify risk. Again, we empower all employees, including our facilities staff and our senior managers and the board, to identify risk, IT risk, in support of the business's objectives. We can use checklists. We can facilitate group workshops, brainstorming. We can issue questionnaires or undertake individual interviews with colleagues, with line managers. We can conduct risk scenarios and risk descriptions, multiple ways to identify risk. And the method we use is not as important as the risk that we end up capturing. So don't worry if you don't have experience in facilitating brainstorming sessions or group workshops. The most important thing that you will do as a risk professional is to first and foremost identify those risks with the support and inclusion of all employees. Again, you may recall we've all agreed that if we develop a good relationship across the different business units, we'll be more likely to have employees coming to us if they've identified an IT risk. It's never lonely at the top if you pull others along with you, or if you carry others along with you, if you bring others along with you. So IT risk management, IT risk identification. is not a job to be undertaken in isolation. We can also evaluate opinions, seek opinions, feelings, ideas, focus groups, surveys. The most important thing again is that we identify risks for each critical information asset. What do we need to empower us as risk professionals to identify risk? We first need to understand our businesses' regulatory, legal, and contractual obligations. If we don't understand the regulatory environment within which we're operating, for example, the financial services sector, the pharmaceutical sector, the medical sector, if we don't understand the standards, the regulations, the policies that guide our business's operations, we can't identify regulatory, legal, or contractual risks, business risks, commercial risks. We need to understand business processes. We need to understand the different stakeholders within our organizations. And we definitely need to understand the technologies that are in use. We understand the different technologies, the usage of those technologies, and the impact upon the business if these technologies were to be unavailable, for example. We need to be able to identify relevant threats and vulnerabilities. We need to be able to maintain the risk log or risk register, as it's called in other workplaces. That is the most important document that we will be maintaining on an ongoing basis. We will be reading that document on an ongoing basis as risk professionals. We'll also need to be able to evaluate the identified risks, including the probability of these risks materializing and the impact on the business in the eventuality of these risks materializing. Again, this is not a one-man show. We'll be doing all of this in conjunction with different business units. You may be on a governance committee, information assurance or information governance or information security working group or working committee, where you discuss all of these things. But a word of warning, it's so important, whether certified or not, for us to read, to get into the habit of reading, for us to be able to understand the regulatory environment that we're operating in, or the legal obligations on our organizations, or the contractual obligations from IT or information security contracts. We need to be able to read, to enjoy reading, to enjoy learning for a lifetime. We need to be able to read standards and understand how those standards apply to our businesses or our organizations. We can also take a look at historical events within our organizations. I used to work in a place, in a business where each year, the end of the year, when all senior managers were preparing our budgets for the following year, the budgeting and forecasting system would go down. And that was because there were so many managers and senior managers across the business trying to access this system at the same time towards the year end. And after 2 years, that enabled the team to put together a risk assessment and mitigations to reduce the risk of that system going down each year towards year end. So we can identify risk from historical events. We could also hold workshops on scenarios, risk scenarios. We could also seek expert opinion. And nowadays, we can readily seek expert opinion because there's so many institutes that we could subscribe to. SANS, NCSC. We could also join LinkedIn groups, IT risk LinkedIn groups, InfoSec LinkedIn groups. Multiple avenues to learn how to identify risk. We could also sit down with the different business units and understand their business processes. How does HR conduct the end-to-end recruitment process, for example? How does payroll conduct the end-to-end payroll process? How do they collate hours worked to know what to pay rotated staff? How do they calculate annual leave payments? So by examining these business processes, we could identify risk. We could also identify risks from changed systems, newly adopted systems. So there are multiple ways, and we shouldn't hesitate to adopt different methods to identify risks within our businesses. Here are some sources of risk. If there are non-existing antivirus software in place or anti-ransomware controls, that is a source of risk. If an organization has disgruntled employees in place, they will be a source of risk or could be a source of risk. Poor physical security controls, where the back door, for example, is left open for delivery personnel, and that is where your data center is located. That is a source of risk. Weak access controls on systems where an organization hasn't enabled multi-factor authentication, where employees are required to enter not only a password to access systems, but also another method of authentication. Could be a token, could be biometric identification, such as a face scan. But where access controls implemented are weak, that is a source of risk. A lack of change management processes, where changes are implemented without being tested. No formal process in place for hardening systems. Remember, we talked about hardening, where we agreed that the majority of users only use about 20 to 40% of their system's applications. And whilst each application on our systems or our mobile devices are a source of risk, we could reduce that risk by removing unneeded applications, closing down unneeded or unused ports on our systems at work. That is what we refer to as hardening. Lack of redundancy or resilient systems, lack of backups. Lack of backups. And I'd say a lack of tested backups, where we back up all of our data, and yet we never test to see if we can recover that data. That is a source of risk. And then untrained users, untrained employees who are unaware of their obligation or responsibility to identify and manage risk alongside IT and information security. These are all different sources of risk. Social engineering risk. This is where we have cyber criminals manipulating human beings, employees, into divulging or sharing private information or data. In some cases, allowing them to gain access to systems, unauthorized access to systems. In some cases, our employees may unwittingly share this information, resulting in the spread of malicious software or malware across our workplace systems. How do we mitigate social engineering risk? We can only do that through ongoing tailored training and awareness sessions. Why tailored training? Because there is a risk referred to as spear phishing or whaling attacks. What is a whaling attack or spear phishing attack? That is where a cyber criminal attempts to obtain information or indeed finances from senior managers. That's why it's important that we tailor our training and awareness sessions. We provide specific training to our facility staff, physical security, urging them to hand in any dropped USB sticks rather than put them on a desk for an employee to pick up the next morning, oblivious to the fact that that USB stick may have been dropped by a cyber criminal to log their keystrokes on their laptop. We need to provide tailored training to our boards and to senior management so they understand they could be the target of a spear phishing or whaling attack. Around 2014 or thereabouts, I read in the newspapers of a CIO, Chief Information Officer, and a CEO, Chief Executive Officer. Both of them were dismissed from their organizations because they'd transferred around 60 million Australian dollars to cyber criminals through a social engineering attack. If we're not training our senior managers, enabling them to understand that they are a risk, that they could place the organization at risk rather, we could be doing our organizations a disservice. So tailored training and awareness, ongoing tailored training and awareness, not just a one-off. And here's the attack cycle for social engineering. Criminals start by gathering background information on a victim through social media, through ringing up unaware employees, through viewing our LinkedIn profiles. I remember delivering a speech somewhere many years ago, and a delegate came up to me at the end of the speech and he said, "You live near me." And I asked him how he knew this. And he said, "On your LinkedIn profile, you have written that you are a school governor in this area, and I live in this area." Cyber criminals are able to gather a lot of background information on unsuspecting victims. So we should watch how much we actually post out there about ourselves to reduce the risk of a social engineering attack against us. Once they've gathered background information, then they try to establish a relationship to build trust. And then they exploit the victim, and then they disengage. So many different social engineering risks here, using voice messages, using text messages or SMS messages, tailgating, following employees or following staff into an office with a badge turned back to front so that a legitimate employee thinks that is a colleague without seeing the picture of the person on the badge. Software development lifecycle risk. When a company is developing new software or new applications, it's so important, it's vital that security and risk is considered from the idea stage. The minute an organization has an idea and they start putting requirements down on a paper, they need to consider risk, information security risk. There are multiple risks to developing an application in-house or externally indeed. Incomplete or changing requirements, a lack of standards, a failure to follow a selected method, a failure to integrate security into each phase of the project from the requirements gathering phase, and a lack of oversight and accountability. But the most vital risk in the software development lifecycle is that failure to consider security from the requirements gathering phase and throughout the lifecycle of that software or application. IT operations risk, failure to monitor systems, disabled logs that don't capture critical activity on the infrastructure. Another risk, of course, is where logs are actually enabled and they capture a wealth of information, but that information is never reviewed. Misconfiguration of equipment resulting in users being unable to access systems at critical times. A lack of training and awareness, incompatible equipment and legacy systems, outdated systems which are no longer supported by vendors. The vendors have gone out of business and the organization is using these legacy systems that were created or manufactured 50 years ago. An advanced persistent threat risk. What is this? This is an attack where cyber criminals or hackers gain access onto a network and then they actually stay on that network in the background for months in some cases, for years in some cases. Again, I once delivered a workshop and this delegate who worked for a very large, renowned company said that he was the CISO of that company and that they had just discovered an open backdoor from an advanced persistent threat attacker, a cyber criminal, and that open backdoor had been in place for over 3 years. So goodness knows what this attacker had spent those 3 years doing on that network. Sometimes we have a back door left open by software developers who have developed that application for us, and they've forgotten to close the back doors. Sometimes it's a maintenance company. If you consider software or games such as PlayStation. Now, don't quote me on this because I don't own a PlayStation, but I have some young lads that actually do own a PlayStation. But my understanding of the PlayStation is that they're able to subscribe for new games and download those new games through that through the PlayStation, which would suggest that the manufacturers have a door, a back door that is open. And I do know that many years ago, one of the boys suggested to me that they had had some tokens stolen by a cyber criminal who had seemingly accessed their PlayStation and stolen their tokens. I don't understand what tokens are, but that happened. That person may have been sitting on their PlayStation waiting for them to purchase tokens or purchase new players or whatever they did before that happened. But this is a risk within organizations. IT risk, technology risk, hardware risk, software risk, operating systems risks, APIs, applications, database risks, virtual private network risks, just various risks that we need to consider as IT risk professionals. IT architecture risk, ability to bypass controls, access and authentication controls. A cyber criminal could bypass those. The failure to separate sensitive data and applications, to segregate the network, to segregate our infrastructure, putting a firewall in between systems that can be accessed via the web and those that shouldn't be exposed to the web. Misconfiguration of equipment, that is an IT architecture risk. And that happens often in some organizations. Unpatched systems, no hardening, as we've mentioned, software piracy, disclosure of sensitive data, incorrect access controls, where employees, including privileged users from IT, for example, or senior management, have inappropriate access to systems that they shouldn't have access to. Applications testing risk, using production data in testing, disclosure of sensitive data, corruption of production data. So instead of using dummy data in testing, we're using production data, live data, that could potentially result in corruption of that data. Lack of quality assurance and standards, lack of separation of the development and production environments in the workplace. No rollback plans in case of a project or a systems implementation failure. We're rolling out a new application to the entire business, and we don't have any rollback plans in the eventuality of the application failing. So we've rolled this application out to 5,000 employees or users. The application has caused these 5,000 users' systems to freeze. And yet we don't have a rollback plan to roll the application back in that eventuality of it causing user systems to freeze. These are all risks that we'd be required to identify as IT risk professionals. Implementation risk. We've got the risk of a loss of data integrity, operational failures, as I've just mentioned there previously. There are risks if we were to do a parallel changeover where both the old system or application are operating together, side by side. There are risks if we were to conduct a phased changeover, where we move one department at a time to the new system. With the parallel changeover, we're moving different users from all departments over at the same time as the new system is running. And there's a potential for data corruption with both systems running in parallel. An abrupt changeover, sometimes referred to as a big bang approach, also holds some risk, where we're moving everyone over in one go. We need to test things. We need to have a solid rollback plan in that instance. Confidentiality, integrity, availability, the CIA triad risk. There will always be risk to the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of our information assets, not only within our workplaces, but also our personal information assets. The cyber criminal will always be desperate to get a hold of our information, critical information. They're not looking to steal a PC with no information on it, or with non-critical information on it. If a criminal steals your laptop, what they're looking for is personal information, passwords to bank accounts, sensitive information about you that they can use to further exploit you, to commit further crimes, including identity theft. So we identify within our workplaces risks to the confidentiality, integrity, or availability of our data and information assets. Data privacy risk. There is that risk to electronic data, paper data, data in transit, data at rest on our computers, data in filing cabinets, data displayed on screen without a screen mask to prevent people walking around us or behind us who don't have a need to know what's on our screens. nothing preventing them from staring at our screens. Data in archives. Why is there a privacy risk to data in our archives? We're not required, we do not need to store data, personal data in particular, of any living person beyond a period for which we need to use that information. With banks, for example, they can only hold data, personal data, on you and I for up to 6 or 7 years after the relationship with the bank has ended. So if I close my account with a bank, they would be legally obliged to hold on to my account and personal data for 6 or 7 years after I close that account, but no longer than that. So if we've got data in archives that has been there for about 20 years, and we're not legally obliged to retain that data, we could find ourselves in breach of data privacy regulations. So as IT risk professionals, we need to remain aware of any local and global data privacy regulations. Again, some regulations, such as the GDPR, apply to global corporations, not just to organizations, companies in the EU. As long as a company stores or processes the data of an EU resident, then they are legally obliged to comply with the General Data Protection Regulations, GDPR. Identity access management risk, the AAA risk, authentication. What is authentication? Thank you for responding in the chat window. That is the process of identifying a user before they log in to the network. What is an identity document that most of us on this workshop actually hold? Thank you, yes. A passport. A passport is an identifier. It identifies us. Authorization. And I can see us typing in the chat window there already. Yes, so that is where once a user has been granted, or once a user has actually been identified, they are then granted privileges. So once a user has identified themselves on our systems by entering a username and a password, once they have authenticated onto our systems, they are then authorized to perform certain actions, such as to open a document, to delete folders, to read certain folders. And in some instances, they are denied access to certain folders. That is authorization. accounting, insufficient audit trails. In some cases, we don't audit. Our security posture. With authorization, the key risk is that we can grant users more privileges than they are due, especially when a user changes roles, moves from one team to another. In some workplaces, the user is simply given permissions for their new department, for their new role, and IT may forget to remove their existing privileges for their soon-to-be old role. Over privileges, that is a risk. Or granting IT staff domain admin permissions when they may only require systems administrator permissions to administer a particular system rather than the entire domain. When we log access, authentication, privileges on our infrastructure, we need to ensure that we are actually reviewing that audit trail. We are monitoring, we are reviewing. Those audit logs, rather than simply compiling those logs and not doing anything with the nuggets to be gained from within those logs. Here's the SDLC, Software Development Lifecycle. Starts with the project kickoff and then initiation of the project. Here's where we need to first start considering security, requirements gathering, that phase. When we're now conducting the analysis, the design of the software, development, testing, deployment, operation, and maintenance, and what? When we're disposing of the software, we need to consider security. We need to consider security. Have we got data in the application or system that we're about to dispose of? Personal data, administrator passwords. So in each of these phases, from the requirements gathering phase to operation and maintenance, when the system is in use, when it's being maintained, and when before the software is disposed of, we need to consider security. Here are some inputs into our risk register or log. Risk workshops, we can gather risks from there. Pen test reports or vulnerability assessment reports. Incidents. When there's an incident, we can document some more risks as that incident unfolds, and during a lessons learned session after the incident has been resolved. Mainstream media, MSM, we could learn of risks, a new malware, a new ransomware is due to be released. SOC 2 assessment reports from our vendors, or indeed our own SOC 2 assessment reports. Identify risks, log these. Auditor reports, annual reports and financial statements. That's so important. We need to learn to read our company's annual reports and financial statements to identify new projects that the organization may be embarking on in the long term, and any risks that may arise from these new projects. Disaster recovery and business continuity plans, public forums, town halls, and then from our internal computer emergency response teams and our SOC teams. Where we identify risk and we include those risks, document these in our risk log or risk register. What is a RACI? A RACI is the stakeholder register that contains a list of stakeholders. R stands for those responsible for managing and remediating the risk. A is those who are ultimately answerable, accountable for the risk. That is our board, an SMT. Consulted, they will provide feedback and advice to the responsible and accountable individuals. So for example, if an IT architecture risk has been identified, the Chief Information Officer may be the person who is the risk owner. They would delegate the responsibility of mitigating the risk to the IT manager, for example, or the IT architecture manager. They would, whilst mitigating the risk, be providing feedback to the CIO and to the board. And there will be stakeholders who will simply need to be kept up to date regarding the progress of the risk mitigation, including users, including senior management again. So the RACI is not just used for identifying stakeholders during risk mitigation actions or program, but they're used to identify those to be communicated with. So we don't simply log who's responsible, who's accountable, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be kept informed. We use this as a tool to communicate with these stakeholders. Vulnerability identification. How do we identify vulnerabilities? Well, we could take a look out for missing or ineffective controls. Controls that have been configured but are not simply serving the purpose for which they were implemented. Antivirus software that isn't updated automatically on a daily basis, or it doesn't check for updates on a daily basis. We could have some systems where antivirus hasn't actually been installed on these. Network application and hardware vulnerabilities. Insufficient disk space. Insufficient storage or disk space, or insufficient processing power to serve the entire workplace users. Buildings with poor access control, inexperienced or untrained, unaware employees. That is a vulnerability. The organizational culture, if toxic, is a vulnerability, where employees don't feel able to speak up where they identify a risk or they notice an issue. That is a vulnerability, a toxic culture. Inefficient processes and resistance to change. These are all weaknesses that could result in poor outcomes with regards to risk management in an organization. Here is a sample risk log where I've identified some risks in a fictitious company. So first risk of a ransomware attack resulting in thousands of customers being unable to place orders for the duration of the outage. Could also result in unauthorized access to customer, personal and sensitive data, including credit card information. Now, I've taken a fictitious e-commerce company. That is their business. So what category of risk is this? Commercial risk, financial risk. It could impact upon the business commercially and financially. If customers are unable to place orders, if a successful ransomware attack takes place. So commercially and financially, that would be two impacts. Cybersecurity, it is a cybersecurity risk. A ransomware attack is clearly a cybersecurity risk. Reputational risk. If this e-commerce company is attacked successfully and customer personal and sensitive data is stolen, that would result in reputational risk and regulatory risk. They could experience regulatory fines and legal challenge by or from the customers. Business continuity risk. In the event that a ransomware attack is successful, the system or systems could be down for a long time. Then we have the risk of typo squatting, resulting in unsuspecting employees downloading malware, including ransomware, onto work devices. What is typo squatting? Well, that is where a cyber criminal sets up a similar website address or domain, registers a similar website domain to a legitimate company's domain, such as registering lbd.com as ldb.com. If lbd.com is an e-commerce site that services thousands, millions of customers, and this cyber criminal goes and registers a domain as ldb.com in an attempt to draw LBD customers to this domain where they have got false orders on the site, on the website, and unsuspected customers simply type in their credit card details to that site. What will the impact to this business be, to the e-commerce business? It would be commercial, financial, cybersecurity. But why would it not be a personal data or regulatory risk? Because the company, the e-commerce company, can't really do anything to stop another company from, or a cyber criminal from setting up a domain name that is similar. They could actually try to raise a legal challenge, but that would only be after this cyber criminal may have managed to steal from the e-commerce company's customers. Then we've got a risk of whaling spear phishing attacks against senior officials, resulting in the disclosure of sensitive or personal information or disbursement of undue financial assets. Remember the CIO and CEO that I mentioned earlier, where they disbursed 60 million Australian dollars to cyber criminals. Here are different risk categories here. And here is the threat actors. Here's the vulnerabilities here. Unaware board members and SMT members. Lapsed financial approval processes and data handling compliance processes. In that company where the CIO and CEO managed to hand out 60 million to cyber criminals, if there was a good financial approval process in place, that wouldn't have happened. I couldn't understand how a CEO could have access to simply, at the press of a button, authorize the transfer of 60 million to another account without a 4-eye check taking place. We'll take a look later at an assessment of one of these risks, but for now, we're simply identifying the risk. Risk of unavailability of key IT staff during the pandemic. That is an HR risk, information and cybersecurity risk, commercial risk, because we may have to close down if our critical IT staff are unable to support us. It's also a business continuity risk. So these are just some sample risks that I've identified for an e-commerce company. Let's take a look at IT risk assessment. That is domain 2 of this examination. And it's also something that we would need to be able to deliver as IT risk professionals. Risk identification versus risk assessment. Risk identification is the identification of assets, threats, and vulnerabilities, and the documentation of identified risk to these in the risk register. A risk assessment is the evaluation of potential effects or the impact of a materialized risk on the business, and an evaluation of the probability or the likelihood of a risk materializing. Risk assessment, this is where we evaluate the likelihood, probability, or impact, and sometimes the proximity of a risk. What is the proximity of a risk? That is, how close are we to this risk materializing? So say, for example, in the instance of the issue that I mentioned earlier, whereby towards the end of the financial year, which was March for this company, March, a budgeting system kept failing due to the number of users attempting to prepare their budgets at the same time. In September of the preceding year or the previous year, if I had been asked to evaluate that risk of the system going down, I would have said this risk is likely to go down in 6 months' time towards the end of the financial year based on historical events, based on the fact that the system has done this for the previous 2 years. So sometimes we will be required to evaluate the proximity of a risk, in addition to the likelihood and the impact. Risk assessment steps, we first need to validate the board / senior management team's risk appetite. If a risk is within tolerance or within the appetite of the board, we simply document that risk. We document that risk so that everyone's aware of the risk, and just in case the board's risk appetite changes in future, we document the risk. We then identify and account for the value of our information assets. We classify these information assets based on their value to the business, conduct a risk assessment in business terms. We take a look at the cost of information security controls to mitigate the risk to these information assets versus the cost of potential losses if the risk were to materialize. We obtain board risk acceptance for whatever actions we will take with regards to the risk, and then we input everything, update the corporate risk register. Those are the risk assessment steps. How do we validate the risk appetite of the board and SMT? Well, why do we do that, first of all? We need to ensure that management understands the significance of accepting each risk. We need to understand that senior management reaches informed decisions about each risk. That they're not just plucking a finger in the air and saying, yes, we'll accept that. We need to ensure that we validate the risk appetite and obtain documentation, a sign-off by management or from management with regards to their risk acceptance. Value at risk assessment. What is the VAR? That quantifies a summary of the worst projected loss to an asset over a specified time frame with a given level of confidence. I'll just talk about the steps here because this would need to be done in conjunction with finance. This isn't a finance lecture, although we will be talking about some financial calculations later on. But to calculate the value at risk, to quantify this, we need to identify the threats, estimate the likelihood, estimate the value of the asset at risk, and apply risk mitigation. Information asset classification. Why do we classify information? Can anyone respond to that in the chat window? For security, for applying controls. The idea behind classifying information assets is that not each information asset is of equal value. We can't secure everything, so we're seeking to secure information assets of value to our businesses, to our organizations. So we wouldn't apply the same security controls to information that we publish on our public website, public facing website. We wouldn't secure that information because the information is public. However, we would secure our customer data, our employee personal data. We'd secure that. So information asset classification defines the effort required to secure different levels of information assets. The different levels that I've just cited there being customer data, employee data, data on our public-facing website. Could tag those different resources with tags such as private information, personal data, sensitive information, confidential. And who is responsible for classifying information assets? It is the owner of the asset that classifies that information. For example, financial data could be classified by the chief financial officer or the head of finance. Employee records could be classified by the HR director. The owner of the information knows how valuable the information is to the business. In some cases, only the owner of that information knows the content of the information. IT shouldn't have access to HR data of all employees because they are custodians hired to back up that data, for example, to safeguard that information. That doesn't mean that we should know what is in those records. So it's not IT's responsibility to classify information, rather it's the owner of the records that does that. IT risk assessment. That is an analysis to establish the probability and impact to the business of all identified risk. During the assessment, we review existing controls in place and we identify new controls to mitigate each risk. When we're identifying new controls, for example, a training and awareness program, a new firewall, a new backup system, placing some systems, some workloads in the cloud. We do that with relevant stakeholders. We conduct a review, systems review, or process review with relevant stakeholders. During the IT risk assessment, we prepare an action plan to mitigate identified risk, to reduce identified risk. Then we update the senior management team to enable them, empower them to make informed decisions. Then we update the risk register with risk assessment outcomes. We can have qualitative, scenario-based, subjective risk assessments, estimations, or we could use my preferred method of assessing risk, which is quantitative risk assessments, where we try to put a dollar value to each risk, because that is the language of the board and SMT. How much is at risk? How much will controls cost to mitigate this risk? Semi-quantitative risk assessment, that is a combo of quantitative and qualitative risk assessment, which assesses a monetary value or a number, a risk score to different risk scenarios. Risk responses: eliminate, avoid or terminate, reduce, mitigate, transfer or accept. And we'll take a look at these. Mitigation. What is risk reduction or risk mitigation? That is where we're seeking to reduce the likelihood of a risk materializing or the impact of a risk if it were to materialize by implementing a variety of controls. Risk avoidance, that would need to be a decision taken by senior management to stop an activity that has given rise to a risk, such as let's stop using legacy equipment that is unsupported or that is likely to fail. We need to replace these. Let's close down an office in a location that is prone to flooding. Or let's close down a data center and relocate that data center to a new location that is not prone to flooding. The board will consider avoiding a risk and stopping the activity that has given rise to risk, often when there are no cost-effective controls available to mitigate the risk. Or in some cases, they may say, we're going to apply these controls initially, and if they don't reduce the risk, then we're going to need to stop that activity. Risk transference. When we insure a risk, what we're doing is we're seeking to reduce the financial impact to our businesses in the event the risk were to materialize. When we outsource to an external service provider, we're seeking to reduce the probability of the risk occurring. If we outsource our payroll processes to a third party, it's usually because we consider that that third party company may have a specialism in payroll services. So rather than keep that in-house and have to train new payroll staff each time an established payroll staff leaves, we seek to reduce or transfer the risk to a service provider that is their sole business. Risk acceptance, that is the management decision to acknowledge and accept the risk with no further action taken to reduce the risk. This isn't management ignoring the risk, because ignoring a risk is not an option. So an accepted risk must be recorded and signed off by the risk owner and monitored in the risk register / log. Why do we need to still monitor the risk? Well, that's because the risk likelihood could change, or the potential impact of the risk could change. Regulations may sometimes actually mandate that controls are implemented regardless of the cost to an organization, where the board has taken the view that the costs to mitigate the risk outweigh the benefits to be derived from the risk reduction efforts. If regulators come in and say, okay, these controls need to be implemented across the sector or within this company, regardless of the cost, then we have to do exactly that. Ownership of risk. We need to define who owns controls, who owns the risk response, who owns the risk response plans, and who will be responsible, who owns reporting and compliance with regards to each risk. Risk assessment considerations, likelihood and impact. When we discuss impact, what we're referring to is the question, what would the effect be on the business if the risk were to materialize? What would the effect be on the business if the risk were to materialize? Here's some impacts: loss of information, loss of system, loss of cells. In some cases, the impact could be that the company is forced to close. A company may lose its ability to continue to trade if it loses, a small company, if it were to lose 60 million to a cyber criminal. That would be a massive impact. An impact on reputation may lead to a loss of customers. Likelihood. That is where we're asking ourselves the question, how likely is it that the risk will materialize? Taking everything into account, taking the vulnerabilities that we have, taking the threats to this information asset. How likely is it that the risk will materialize? That is the question we asked ourselves. Remember, a vulnerability is a weakness that could be exploited. And a threat is a potential or actual undesirable event. Could be a malicious threat, such as a distributed denial of service attack, or an accidental threat, user error, or an incidental threat, such as a failure of a critical technical system.